Hi, class. In this next short video, we're going to be introducing CSF, cerebral spinal fluid flow, understand a little bit about the ventricles and the flow of CSF and what its primary functions are. So when we look at cerebral spinal fluid, typically in circulation, there's anywhere from 80 to 150 milliliters or 3 to 5 ounces of it in circulation. Now, it's a clear liquid. It contains glucose and it contains proteins and ions. And in terms of function, there is mechanical protection, there's chemical protection, and some circulation function. In terms of mechanical protection, it kind of acts as like a buoy, right? If you are on a boat and you look at the channel, you can see that there's floating buoys, right? The way those buoys float. So the mechanical protection is that it acts as a buoy. It helps to buoy the brain or float the brain and soften any type of impact that you may have in terms of head trauma so that your brain doesn't hit the skull, right, or the bone itself. So it's designed to kind of cushion as much as it can. In terms of chemical protection, it's involved in optimizing the ionic concentrations for action potentials. And in terms of circulation, it's involved in the nutrients and the waste products to and from the bloodstream. When we look at a lateral view of the brain, so over here is anterior and this side is posterior. We know it's posterior because right there, this is the cerebellum, right? That's the cerebellum, so that's posterior. Now, deep within that diencephalon, that region of the diencephalon, from this view, we can see the lateral ventricles. We could see that there's two of them. One would be in the left hemisphere of the brain. The other would be in the right hemisphere of the brain. And what separates the two would be that dura mater extension called the septum pellucidum that separates the two. Here is the third ventricle. And then down here at the bottom is the fourth ventricle, right there. So how does the CSF flow from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle? Well, there's a drainage duct right here called the interventricular foramen of Monroe. Interventricular foramen of Monroe. Now that's the drainage duct going from lateral ventricle 1 and 2 into the third ventricle. Now, for that CSF to go from the third ventricle down into the fourth ventricle, it has to flow through the cerebral aqueduct. Sometimes it's called the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvia. Some books call it the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvis or Sylvia. After the CSF flows into the fourth ventricle, there's a few escape routes that CSF can flow. It can flow through a lateral opening, a lateral aperture. It can flow through a median aperture. And it can flow down right through the center of the spinal cord through the central canal. So there are three different routes that CSF can take after the fourth ventricle: median aperture, lateral aperture, and the central canal. What is actually producing the cerebral spinal fluid? It is ependymal cells. That's what's producing them. And they line the ventricles through a group of capillaries that are called the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is found in all of the ventricles, the lateral ventricles, third and fourth ventricle. So the choroid plexus is nothing other than a cluster of capillaries that are covered by the ependymal cells, and that's what's producing the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, that's from a lateral perspective. If we look at it, bird's eye view on a transverse cut, right? That's your transverse section, a superior view. From here, we can see the lateral ventricles. This is one on one hemisphere. Here's the second in the other hemisphere. And what separates those two ventricles is that septum pellucidum. What's producing the fluid is the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is made up of these ependymal cells. And those ependymal cells are producing the cerebral spinal fluid, the CSF. Now, from this view, we can see again the two hemispheres of the brain. You can see the two ventricles. So here's ventricle 1 and here's ventricle 2. Those are the lateral ventricles. And right here, this would be the third ventricle. So how does CSF escape the lateral ventricles to get into the third ventricle? Well, it uses that interventricular foramen of Monro. And there's two of them. There's one on this side, and there's one on this side. Then going from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle, it goes through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvia. And then you've got those three options. After it enters the fourth ventricle, it can flow through the median aperture, the lateral aperture, or right down the central canal. And the CSF is going to flow in that subarachnoid space. So right here, you can see in a more linear fashion, right? You've got the lateral ventricles, and there's a choroid plexus there that produces CSF. In the third ventricle, there's a choroid plexus that produces CSF. And in the fourth ventricle, there's a choroid plexus that produces CSF. The flow is going to go from the lateral ventricles 1 and 2 into the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen of Monro. From the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvis. From the fourth ventricle, it can flow through the lateral aperture and the median aperture, and it goes in that subarachnoid space all the way up into the arachnoid villi, which I'll show you where that is. The arachnoid villi is up here near the dural venous sinus. And now it's going to enter the venous blood. It's going to go to the heart and lungs, back into the arterial blood, and it continues its circulation all over again. Here is that superior sagittal sinus right up at the top. Here is the falx cerebri, that's dura mater, that's separating the two hemispheres. And within that superior sagittal sinus, or that dural venous sinus, that's where we have these arachnoid villi. Okay? The arachnoid villi are going to serve the purpose to reabsorb that cerebral spinal fluid. And the reabsorption rate should be equal to the rate at which it's being produced. So you produce it and then you reabsorb it, and then you produce it and you reabsorb it. The problem is if there's a blockage somewhere or there's improper drainage of the CSF. So if there's a blockage of the CSF, a blockage of that drainage, and that can come from like some sort of physical obstruction, like a tumor or a mass that's blocking that drainage. It can happen from inflammation in the brain, like a meningitis, that's inflammation. It can happen from any type of developmental malformation, maybe something from the birthing process, where they squeeze with forceps or a vacuum extraction to get out a baby. It creates a developed malformation of the bone in the brain. Or there's some sort of hemorrhage, some sort of hemorrhagic type of injury. When there's the continual production of the CSF without equal rate of reabsorption, you get this accumulation of fluid that they call water on the brain, which is hydrocephalus. Right? In newborns, there are these skull bones, these fontanelles, that allow a small degree of expansion for internal pressure, but it can only handle so much. And if there's too much pressure, then you get this type of expansion. You get this, which is what hydrocephalus is. So they have to create a shunt and put a drainage shunt. These neurosurgeons can implant a drainage shunt that helps to divert the cerebral spinal fluid out of the brain into the veins of the neck or into the abdomen. That's called hydrocephalus.